With the best all-inclusive vacation deals to Mexico and the Caribbean, booking your getaway with Cheap Caribbean Vacations means you have more freedom to do your deal. Whether you want to enjoy snorkeling, endless margaritas, and more, or simply soak up the sun and sand in a tropical paradise, Cheap Caribbean Vacations has your deal for that. Plan and book the exact getaway you want at exactly the right price for you by using our exclusive budget beach finder. Or find a featured all-inclusive package to Oasis Hotels and Resorts and do your deal at cheapcaribbean.com.
You know, some people say that Odoo business management software is like fertilizer, the way it promotes growth and all. But other people say Odoo is like a magic beanstalk because it grows with your company and is also magically affordable. And there's some people who would even say Odoo's individual software programs come together to build the perfect suite like building blocks. Well, Odoo is all of these things. Fertilizer, magic beanstalk, building blocks for business. So sign up now at odoo.com. ODOO.com.
When a progressive Methodist minister began receiving threatening letters in 1987, it was believed to have come from an outsider. But evidence led to it being someone in the church. Then after a brutal attack, the police began to question if this was a setup from the start. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. This episode is one from my Patreon vault. I know not everyone listened to my New Year episode, but I mentioned then that I was going to start redoing older Patreon episodes that are either unsolved or not officially completely solved. They should never have been behind a paywall at all, so this is my way of fixing that. This case isn't one that can just be called solved or unsolved. When I put in the show notes whether a case is solved or unsolved, sometimes you'll see the word disputed there, and that'll be there for this one. We are going to start with Margaret Nicolai, who was born in Wisconsin in 1948. She went by the nickname Peggy, and even as a child, it was clear she was incredibly musically talented. She studied voice and piano, but she decided to go to Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas to get her master's degree, focusing on sacred organ music. While Peggy was studying at SMU, she met Walker Railey, who was a student at Perkin Theological Seminary in Dallas, which is also part of Southern Methodist University. Like how Peggy's skills with music were obvious when she was younger, Walker seemed to be headed towards the ministry young as he grew up in Kentucky. When he was a junior in high school, he was elected president of the area Methodist Youth Fellowship. And when he was 17, he wrote a sermon and asked his mom to help him find a church that would let a teenager preach, even if it was just for one day. And when he gave that sermon, there was an audience of 300 people who were impressed with both the quality of his sermon and his messaging, but also his ability to deliver it. And Walker liked that. Who at 17 doesn't like to hear that people are impressed with you? Walker first attended Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green to study history, and he worked at a furniture store to support himself. But that real passion for preaching meant that he was taking any chance he had to speak in churches and at revival services, even if he had to walk miles to get to whatever church had invited him as a guest. So it seemed like a pretty natural move for Walker to attend seminary, and that is where he met Peggy. In 1971, 24-year-old Walker and 22-year-old Peggy got married. When Walker finished his doctoral degree in 1973, he became an associate pastor at a pretty big church, First United Methodist in Dallas. He did leave for a few years to take another position, but in 1980, First United took him on as a senior minister. And this was huge. This was not the sort of role a 33-year-old typically got. In fact, Walker was one of the youngest people to be in that position in the church. He was appointed ahead of other ministers who had more seniority. Many of the people he graduated with were still working their way up from smaller churches, while he was a senior minister at a church with thousands of congregants. They had a staff of 65 just to keep the church running. With getting this position so young, there was a lot of talk that Walker was on the path to become one of the youngest bishops. I mean, it would still take time, but they were thinking by 1988, maybe 1992, that he would be there. But regardless of when he got there, there didn't seem to be a question in anyone's mind that he would eventually become bishop. Walker was very good at what he did, and his delivery and message reached people who hadn't been coming to church regularly before. He spoke out against discrimination and racism in the city of Dallas, telling his mostly middle-class white congregation that things wouldn't get better if they didn't acknowledge the racial tensions and do something about it. He defended gay rights, he was against capital punishment, and he was pro-gun control. And remember, this is Texas in the 1980s. And his messaging worked. As he's preaching equality and love, he is bringing in those younger families who felt there really wasn't a place in the mainstream church for more progressive views. It's not that everyone appreciated his viewpoints or agreed that they should be preached from the pulpit, but even as Walker got pushback, Peggy was by his side, encouraging him to keep going. Walker was going to keep going because he was a pretty ambitious guy, and he expanded his career beyond just preaching on Sundays. In 1986, he had a radio contract to preach on a nationally syndicated show called American Protestant Hour. He signed 2 book deals. He served on community and church boards, and all that with having a wife and 2 young children at home, plus all of the regular tasks of being a minister, like visiting the sick and counseling his congregants, and writing his sermons. I can't really understand how people like this have the same amount of hours in the day as someone like me, seeing how little I get done by comparison. As much as Walker was a rising star, I can't say that he was everyone's favorite person, particularly those who worked in the church. Whenever someone becomes the star of the show, it can lead to some discontentment. Sometimes it's because the person is put on a pedestal and then they can't live up to that, and sometimes colleagues are going to watch one person excel with something that can certainly be perceived as jealousy. On top of that, Walker could also be difficult. He had more ambition than he had patience, and one Catholic priest told D Magazine about a time he rode with Walker to a meeting, and they got stuck in traffic on the freeway. Instead of just waiting it out like everyone else, Walker drove off the road, up an embankment, and out onto the city streets. The thing was, Walker didn't know his way around the side streets, so he went up and down them getting lost, or they would have been better off just wading through the traffic. And this lack of patience also extended to people, and that could lead to outbursts of his temper. Though, as is pretty typical, the people who saw it were those who worked with him regularly, and I would guess his wife. It's not like the general public saw that side of him, and I think we're all like that to some degree. Based on context, we show different sides of ourselves, but it really is the people closest to us who get to see all of those sides. Peggy was similar to this as well, in that she had one side the overall public tended to see, and some people would perceive that as her being lukewarm, unlike the stereotypical charismatic preacher's wife. I think the truth was that Peggy was not like her husband. She was more introverted, and she didn't like the attention and the limelight and the pressure that comes with that. Peggy also seemed to be someone who worked at something we call these days protecting your peace. She didn't want to live according to everyone else's expectations, like the expectation she would be at Walker's side at every church event. She would go to the ones she wanted to go to, and the ones that fit into her schedule, but she wouldn't show up where she didn't want to be and slap a fake smile on. And eventually this extended to regular church services as well. Peggy had always attended, but in the winter of 1986 going into 87, Peggy ended up getting pneumonia, which exhausted her. And then she had the 2 little children and a husband who was very busy and not home a ton. So she started doing even less with the church, including not attending Sunday services every week, particularly since she didn't seem to like to leave the kids in the nursery often. Not everyone at the church, which had literally thousands of congregants, got to know Peggy the way they felt they knew Walker. But for those who had the privilege of getting to know Peggy, she was a loyal friend, protective, and absolutely warm and loving. After reading the perceptions of Walker and Peggy in some of these older articles, it made me start thinking about something I read a while ago about how our society has shifted from a culture of character to a culture of personality. People perceived Walker in one way because of his outgoing, public-facing personality, and they saw Peggy in another because of her quiet, reserved public face. But the truth was that they were both just people who had traits, some good, some bad, and a lot of them just neutral. But it was Walker Railey's public side that started causing some issues, in part because not everyone was a fan of his social justice platform. His beliefs were not terribly unusual for the late 1980s. I mean, we're not talking about the 50s or 60s. However, they were not that common to hear from the pulpit. Another issue was that a lot of people in Dallas who did agree with Walker didn't think they were the source of the issues. They felt like a lot of these problems, particularly issues with racism, came from the more rural areas, not their own Dallas neighborhood. And Walker would confront them with that by basically telling them to listen to Matthew 7:5 and take the beam out of their own eye first. Some of the pushback would just be members not coming back to church. Though in the 7 years Walker was a senior pastor, membership actually climbed, and the church's budget, it doubled. So he was finding more people interested in his message than not. But in 1987, it became clear that someone didn't like his viewpoints at all. Between March 21st and April 19th of that year, Walker received 6 vulgar and threatening letters that directly referenced his social justice teachings, calling him a communist and using racial slurs. The notes were not just someone railing against his preaching. There were also direct threats in there, things like telling him to start looking around the corner because the only good communist was a dead communist. Of the initial 5 letters, 4 were mailed to the church, and 1 was sent directly to the Railey home. The police, of course, were contacted, and they did take some security measures, including being in attendance at church services in case someone tried something in public, and the church installed an alarm system at the Railey family home, and they would end up putting a car phone into Walker's car so he could call for help if needed. We know from what Peggy told her parents about the letters that she was genuinely concerned about Walker's safety, though she didn't get into too many of the details with them about what was in the notes, just that they were threatening. It's possible she didn't want to worry them too much. But she still encouraged Walker to continue his work and to continue preaching racial equality. The last letter of the 6 came on Easter Sunday, April 19th, 1987, and unlike the others, it was not mailed at all. This one was slipped under the office door of another minister. It was addressed to Walker and said something like, quote, "Easter is when Christ arose, but you are going down," end quote. This letter was beyond alarming because it wasn't mailed. It was slipped under the door. That meant the person making the threats was in the church shortly before services were set to begin, and while the police were already there, guarding the place. As far as anyone knew, that was the closest the letter writer had ever gotten physically to Walker Railey. But who would have been able to walk by the offices unnoticed long enough to do this? It would have had to have been a member of the congregation at the very least, but more likely a staff member. Based on that, the church's typewriter was checked. After typing up a similar letter and comparing it to the one slipped under the door, they looked the same. While all brand of typewriters would have the same font, because these are mechanical machines, there can be differences in the keys, like a nick on the tail of a P, or maybe it puts too much pressure on the A. Looking at these characteristics, they can somewhat match a typed letter to a specific typewriter, not unlike matching the marks on shell casings or shoe tread. It's not a perfect science, but it is something. And this is what got the police to consider that they needed to look at the people close to Walker, as in within the church. And they learned this on the morning he was supposed to give an Easter sermon to a very large crowd. No one would have blamed Walker for sending someone else out there to give the sermon. The letter writer had been targeting him specifically, so, go ahead, fake an illness so that you don't alarm the congregation, but let someone else give the sermon. However, Walker had a different idea. He decided to borrow a bulletproof vest from an officer, put his robes over it, and then give his Easter sermon with police officers in the audience. The service went off without incident, and the investigation into the letters continued. Then, just 2 days after Easter, on Tuesday, April 21st, 1987, things took a turn. At 12:43 a.m., Walker Railey called 911 to tell them that he had come home to find his wife, Peggy, on the floor of the garage. She was not responding, but he couldn't tell what was wrong. It wasn't like there was blood around. She was just there on the floor, seizing and breathing, but not responding. When emergency services got to the scene, they transported Peggy to the hospital, while a family friend Walker had called came and got the 2 small children, so Walker and his friend John could also follow Peggy to the hospital. John spoke with the doctor to try to find out what happened to Peggy, and the doctor said that she had injuries to her neck, and he suspected that she had been strangled within an inch of her life. John was shocked. This was not a sudden medical event like it looked like. Someone had actually done this to her. Peggy was hanging on in critical condition, and the doctor could not make any promises. It was touch and go, and it would take time to know, 1, if she would survive, and 2, if she did survive, to what level would she recover? People who are in a coma due to strangulation do not, generally speaking, have a good prognosis due to the amount of brain damage and the length of oxygen deprivation that left them in that condition. So this case was being investigated as an attempted murder case, though they weren't sure if it would then turn into a murder case if Peggy did not survive. So what the investigators started doing was to build out the timeline. And they needed to do that by starting with Walker, since he was the last one to see Peggy before the attack, and he was the one who found her. All right, listeners, are you ready to uncover the secret to youthful skin and vibrant health? Just like a gripping true crime story, the mystery of aging has captivated us for centuries. What if I told you that the answer lies in your body's own collagen? But as I have learned firsthand in recent years, as we age, this vital protein diminishes, leaving us with fine lines, wrinkles, and less elasticity. Enter Native Path Collagen, your ally in the quest for a radiant complexion. Their collagen peptides pack a powerful punch, supporting not just your skin and hair, but your joints, bones, and gut health too. Just imagine a smoother, more youthful you, all while getting lost in the world of chilling crime stories. Okay, true crime listeners, ready to crack the code? Head to getnativepath.com/crimelines for a special discount on your first order. Plus, they're offering my listeners bundles that are not available on their website at up to 45% off, plus free shipping. Native Path Collagen, where the truth is just a scoop away. Their single ingredient formula has thousands of 5-star reviews, over 5 million jars sold, and over 1 million happy customers. It's completely unflavored and it dissolves easily into coffee, smoothies. You can even bake with it. Every order comes with a 365-day money-back guarantee. That link again is getnativepath.com/crimelines for 45% off plus free shipping today, and you can go ahead and click that right in the show notes.
It's true that some things change as we get older. But if you're a woman over 40 and you're dealing with insomnia, brain fog, moodiness, and weight gain, you don't have to accept it as just another part of aging. And with MIDI Health, you can get help and stop pushing through it alone. The experts at MIDI understand that all these symptoms can be connected to the hormonal changes that happen around menopause. And MIDI can help you feel more like yourself again. Many healthcare providers aren't trained to treat or even recognize menopause symptoms. MIDI clinicians are menopause experts. They're dedicated to providing safe, effective, FDA-approved solutions for dozens of hormonal symptoms, not just hot flashes. Most importantly, they're covered by insurance. 91% of MIDI patients get relief from symptoms within just 2 months. You deserve to feel great. Book your virtual visit today at joinmidi.com. That's joinmidi.com.
Tired of restless nights? At Leesa, they know good sleep is essential for mental, physical, and emotional health. From memory foam mattresses to hybrids that keep you cool all night long, Leesa's mattresses offer exceptional comfort and support with free delivery and 100 nights to try out your mattress in the comfort of your home. Go to leesa.com today and get 20% off all mattresses and 2 free pillows. That's LEESA.com and use code IHEART for an extra $50 off your purchase. Remember, no matter who you are, there's a Leesa just for you.
Walker was more than willing to speak with the police, though he had barely slept and the doctors had given him a sedative to help calm him down, so he was a little fuzzy on some of the details under those conditions. But he was able to help build out the basic timeline, saying that he got home from work between 6 and 6:30, and when he pulled into the garage, he found Peggy in there trying to grease either the door latch or a spring because it was sticking and the door wasn't opening and closing smoothly. While she did that, Walker chatted with her for a little bit and she offered him some dinner. She and the kids had already eaten and Walker said he wasn't hungry. The two then shared a glass of wine before Walker left again. He was working on a new book and had to head to the library at Southern Methodist University to look up some references. At some point while he was out, Walker called Peggy from his car phone to check in on her and the kids, but she didn't answer. He decided at that point to just go ahead and head home, and he arrived around 12:30 to 12:40 on April 22nd. He pulled up to the garage, which he noticed the door was already open 2 feet or less, which was odd. But then again, the door had been sticking, so maybe that's why it was open. Walker pushed the button to open the garage the rest of the way, and it first went down before it went up again. Walker then pulled in and noticed that the overhead light that usually came on when the door opened was out, so the garage was very dark. Walker parked next to Peggy's car and started heading into the house. It wasn't until he was in the front of his car that he saw Peggy lying on the ground in front of hers. Walker told the investigators that she was convulsing, and he grabbed her, trying to get her to respond. When he did not get a response, he ran inside both to check on their children and to call 911. Walker said he found his 2-year-old daughter on the floor in the living room with the TV on, and he panicked at first, thinking she must have been hurt or killed as well. But when he picked her up, she immediately woke up. It's assumed that she was in bed, but she woke up, went around looking for a parent, and when she didn't find one, she just laid down in front of the TV and fell back asleep. Once Walker checked on his 5-year-old son and knew he was also unharmed, he called 911. The investigators asked Walker who would want to hurt Peggy, and Walker said the only person he could think of was the mysterious letter writer. Walker was asked if he would take a polygraph if they set it up, and he said yes. After making his statement, Walker went back to Peggy's bedside, and over the next week, that's generally where he could be found. The hospital did have a room he could sleep and work in as needed, so that he wouldn't be far from her when other people came to visit and sit with her. They had so much support that they had to coordinate a visiting schedule because too many people would show up at the same time if they didn't. But even with other people at Peggy's bedside, Walker didn't want to go too far away because it was so touch and go. And because the assumption was that Peggy may have been attacked by the person who had been targeting Walker, the police stationed a guard outside of the room to keep that person from getting to Walker or to Peggy again. As people held vigil at the hospital, the investigation into who did this continued largely outside of the public eye. The case got a lot of media attention, particularly in regards to the letters that led up to the attack. But the police were really not saying much about what was going on as it was happening. But what we know now, as we look back at the investigation, is that they checked the house's alarm system and found that it was functioning and that it had not been tripped by the attacker. But there was one door that was not armed, and that was the garage door. Walker had said it was open anywhere from 1.5 to 2 feet when he first got home, and that would have been enough for someone to crawl in and or out without tripping an alarm. That is, if the alarm was on. The alarm company checked the installation and said everything was in full working order, but I can't really tell from the reporting if the alarm had definitely been set. There were no signs of a struggle in the garage, which makes sense, but also sort of doesn't make sense. Someone had taken out the light bulbs in the garage, which is why they didn't go on when Walker got home. So Peggy likely had been surprised by someone in the dark, and they had the upper hand before she could even fight back. But even so, Peggy had been strangled with a ligature, likely a thin cord or wire that was not left at the scene. But there was no skin under her nails and no scratches on her neck. If someone put something around your neck like that, even in the dark, it would be expected that you would scratch yourself as you tried to pull it off. It didn't look like Peggy had tried to do this. The police also spoke to neighbors, and they got a few witnesses who saw vague things like a man running and a white van, or maybe they heard something like rustling in the bushes. Nothing that would really help identify an attacker. As such, the threatening letters were obviously the strongest lead. Someone threatened Walker Railey, and now his wife was nearly killed. Seems like a pretty direct line from one to the other. A friend of Peggy's told the police that it may not have started with just the letters because Peggy had told her about some nasty calls she had gotten about a year before. The calls came in regularly enough that Peggy had a second phone line installed in the house for personal use. The existing line, which was the published phone number, would just go to an answering machine, and only close friends and family had the other number, so Peggy knew she could safely answer that phone. So there seemed to be harassment from a mystery caller as well as the threatening letters. It's not clear if the two were determined to be connected, but even having these leads didn't mean that the police ignored the statistically most likely suspect, and that was the husband, who was the last one to see Peggy before she was attacked, and the one who found her. In fact, maybe that's how the letters fit in. If they were coming from within the church, who's to say Walker wasn't sending them to himself, either for attention or, well, for this exact thing, to set up the idea that his family was being targeted by an outside force before he then attempted to kill his wife. This seems a little Lifetime movie plot-esque, except the investigators had found that there were some inconsistencies in Walker's story, some big, some small. An example of a small issue was that Walker said Peggy was trying to grease the garage door since it was sticking, but days before the attack, they had the garage door company come out, and everything was in working order when they left. And also, there was no residue of soap or anything else on the door to show that Peggy was doing anything in there. That one was relatively small. A larger issue was with Walker's alibi. He initially told the police he went to the college campus all night to work on his book in the library, and that turned out to not be true. And they could prove this because Walker had something not terribly common in 1987, and I've already mentioned it. It was that brand new car phone installed for security reasons. The car phone was not like a cell phone today. They can't ping or triangulate or use GPS tracking to figure out the movements. But it did record all of the phone calls you made. Back in the olden days, phone records did not always log the calls you made locally, meaning the calls you were not billed for. But it would itemize out long-distance calls because those were billable by the minute, as were car phone bills. Even if you called someone within your area code and your house phone wouldn't have itemized it, the car phone would have. They showed every call with timestamps. Being that Walker had just gotten the phone and hadn't seen a bill yet, maybe he was unaware that it would record these local calls. Or maybe he thought the police would not check. Or maybe he didn't really consider this angle when he gave an alibi because he wasn't necessarily thinking he would need an alibi. But they did check, and what it did was destroy that alibi. Walker said he went to the library calling his wife a couple times that night. But what he neglected to mention was that she was not the only woman he had called that evening. Walker had called 45-year-old Dr. Lucy Papillon. Lucy was a clinical psychologist who had grown up in Dallas, and her father had actually been a well-known bishop from First United prior to his death in 1985. She was twice divorced and practicing in Dallas when she started attending First United again with her mother. And it was at a meeting that she met Walker Railey. Walker had called Lucy 2 times that night, including at 5:58 before he got home from work and again at 7:32 when he should have been at the library, according to what he told the police and what he told his wife. Being a psychologist, it was possible that Walker was seeing Lucy for professional reasons like therapy. But if he had called his therapist that night, why hadn't he mentioned it to the police? Omitting the calls from his story is what made them red flags. The investigators also noticed something else on the phone records. Walker called his house twice from his car phone, supposedly trying to reach Peggy. However, both times he called the public number, the one attached to the answering machine. That's the number Peggy would not have answered. Had he called the other line, she probably would have. So why call the other number? Well, the police came to believe that he did it because he wanted it to go to the answering machine so he could essentially record his alibi. In the first message Walker left, he said that he was leaving one library that was closing to go to another that was open later. He said he didn't have a watch, but that it was about 10:30 or 10:45 when he was calling. Walker told Peggy on the machine to go ahead and lock the garage door if she wanted, and he would just park outside when he got home. But thanks to those car phone records, they knew that the time of this recording was not around 10:30. It was actually 12:03 a.m., an hour and a half later. Walker lied about the time on the machine, and we know it's not just a matter of getting it wrong because he called back at 12:29 and gave the right time. He had to have known 2 hours had not passed between the calls. In the second message that he left, Walker said he was leaving this message because he didn't want to wake Peggy up by using the private line, but in case she got up with the kids and noticed he wasn't home, he wanted to let her know that he was on his way. He said he'd be home around 12:45. These weren't the only issues with Walker's alibi. The police also found a credit card slip for a Texaco station where Walker bought a wine cooler and gas at 8:53 p.m. Again, a time he said he was at the library. This, like the calls from his car phone, place him in his car, driving around instead of being where he said he was. But we do know that Walker had been to the library at some point that night. They had witnesses who had seen him, though they were all over the map about when they remembered seeing him. The real question was if Walker was at the library at the time of the attack on his wife, and to figure that out, they were going to have to narrow down the window on when the attack happened. Again, phone activity came in handy here because Peggy was on the phone a few times during that evening. One call was with a friend around 7:30 who just called to check in on Peggy, knowing she was alone in the house at night with the kids just 2 days after her husband was threatened in church. Peggy said she was fine and turned down the friend's offer to come keep her company. The next call was around 8:30 p.m. Walker used the payphone at the library to call Peggy on the family's private line, so we know at 8:30 he was at the library. According to Walker, he did talk to Peggy at this point, and she said she was getting the kids to bed. From 8:49 until 9:14 p.m., Peggy was then on the phone with her parents who lived in Tyler, Texas. So this was a long-distance call, billed by the minute, so we know exactly when she hung up. And 9:14 p.m. is the last contact anyone had with Peggy. So from when she hung up with her parents until Walker called 911, that was the window the attack happened, so it's about 3.5 hours. With this information, the investigators really wanted to talk to Walker and firm up his alibi for that time frame, as well as confront him about the inconsistencies in his alibi of, I was at the library all night. So on the morning of May 1st, 1987, 9 days after the attack on Peggy, they called up to the officer guarding Walker's room at the hospital to let him know they were heading there to interview him. The guard tried to open the door to let Walker know what was going on and found that the door was locked. When Walker didn't respond to his knocks, he broke the door down and found Walker Railey unconscious in bed. Nearby were mostly empty pill bottles and a 5-page suicide note. Reports on the severity of Walker's condition varied. You'll see one place reporting that they basically pumped his stomach and he was fine, and then others saying that he was in the ICU and it was touch and go. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's Guide on Ethical Reporting recommends avoiding sharing details in suicide notes due to the contagion effect. So I'm not going to cover any more than what is absolutely necessary within the context of this case. In the note Walker left, he did not confess to hurting Peggy, and he also did not outright deny it, like we've seen in other cases, like with Fotis Dulos in the Jennifer Dulos case. It's almost as though Walker didn't realize he was a suspect because that wasn't mentioned at all. What he did talk about was his inner demon that led him to do things he didn't want to do, and that it had eventually overpowered him. The police wondered if this meant violence against his wife or something else. They would not get the chance to ask Walker about it because after he recovered physically, he spent 7 weeks in a local psychiatric hospital and retained a criminal defense attorney who told him not to talk to the cops. In hiring specifically a known criminal defense attorney, some side-eyed Walker. But of course, my listeners know that you should have a criminal defense attorney if you know the police consider you a person of interest or a suspect. But it's not clear that the general public knew that the investigators were looking at Walker Railey at that point. So to them, it may have seemed out of place.
Tired of restless nights? At Lisa, they know good sleep is essential for mental, physical, and emotional health. From memory foam mattresses to hybrids that keep you cool all night long, Lisa's mattresses offer exceptional comfort and support with free delivery and 100 nights to try out your mattress in the comfort of your home. Go to lisa.com today and get 20% off all mattresses and 2 free pillows. That's LEESA.com and use code IHEART for an extra $50 off your purchase. Remember, no matter who you are, there's a Lisa just for you.
Dreaming of hydrated skin amidst these dry winter months? Dime offers clean, master esthetician crafted skincare products that deeply nourish, protect, and hydrate. Their formulas, made with clean ingredients, lock in moisture for skin that stays soft, smooth, and radiant all season long. Hydration starts with Dime's best-selling hyaluronic acid serum, delivering deep moisture where your skin craves it most. This lightweight, fast-absorbing serum helps quench dryness, plump skin, and boost elasticity from the inside out. Once your skin is prepped with the serum, seal in all that hydration with their Dewy Day Cream, a rich, luxurious moisturizer designed to provide all-day softness and lasting glow. Together, this powerful duo keeps your skin smooth, supple, and luminous, even in the harshest weather. Shop the duo now at dimebeautyco.com. That's dimebeautyco.com. And get the hydrated skin of your dreams.
Over the 7 weeks that Walker was hospitalized, it became apparent that Peggy was going to survive. However, the brain damage was so severe that she couldn't communicate, eat, or do anything else for herself. Her brain had survived just enough to keep her basic functions like breathing going. She was in a persistent vegetative state. It was difficult at times for those around her to fully understand her actual condition because she did appear to be alert at times with sleeping and waking cycles, and there were even stories of her seemingly responding to things that people said. But the scans were pretty clear. Whatever she was hearing or seeing was not being processed in her brain. And the prognosis was that she was going to spend the rest of her life like that. Her parents eventually moved her care to a nursing home near them in Tyler, Texas, where they could oversee her care. Walker, in the meantime, had been released from the hospital, but his attorney was not going to let him talk to the police. He arranged for Walker to take a polygraph administered by an independent examiner, and the questions were limited to the attack on Peggy. And Walker denied attacking his wife or knowing who did, and he passed that polygraph. The next day, Walker took a second polygraph, this time with the police and their examiner. His attorney said that they agreed ahead of time not to ask any questions about the threatening letters. This was just going to be about the attack on Peggy. But once they got Walker all hooked up, they did ask about the letters and asked if he knew who sent them. On those questions, the police said he showed deception and that the rest of the test was inconclusive. We have to remember that polygraphs are only measuring a response to the questions, not telling us why you are reacting that way. And Walker went in there thinking he was not going to be asked about the letters, and then they sprung it on him. According to his attorney, that was the issue. He was confused and frankly a bit annoyed after they asked him about things they were not supposed to talk about. That's why his results were unclear. Walker would go on to take a third polygraph again with a private independent examiner, but they did not release those results. And that really is the benefit of taking a polygraph with your attorney and not with the police. If you don't want to release the results, you don't have to. The investigators told the media that polygraphs are not admissible in court anyway. They're just tools in an investigation, and they were more interested in just talking to Walker to clear up the inconsistencies in his story. Even though Walker did not want to talk about the letters when taking the polygraph, and he did not want to speak to the police otherwise, he was giving interviews to the media. And he essentially said he did not write the letters, and if he did, he was smart enough to not have used a church typewriter. And the FBI had confirmed that the source of the letters was that typewriter. As for the suicide attempt, Walker said that he had just sat down and started writing in his journal, and the weight of everything was just pressing on him, and he found his journal writings to start turning into a suicide note. It was an impulsive decision as he started feeling more and more hopeless. The investigators on the case were not feeling hopeless themselves about the investigation, but they were certainly frustrated. Walker kept talking to the media, but not to them. In the hopes to change that, about 3 months after the attack on Peggy Railey in July of 1987, the prosecutor called a grand jury. And that's because the grand jury has a power that the police do not have, and that is the power of the subpoena. Walker was subpoenaed to testify, but as his attorney recommended, he just exercised his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and he did so 43 times. And before you think that makes him sound guilty, his attorney explained that Walker was innocent, but he had nothing to gain by cooperating with a grand jury that had been called basically to investigate him. He had already told the police what he knew, and that was that. The grand jury ended without indicting anyone, and though grand jury proceedings are supposed to be secret, enough of this one leaked to the public to turn some of Walker's supporters against him. And it split the church, with some standing by Walker and others feeling betrayed. The main leak was the testimony of Dr. Lucy Papillon, the psychologist Walker had called twice on the evening his wife was attacked. She admitted under oath, and believing that this was going to be kept out of the public record, that she and Walker Railey had been having an affair for over a year, and she confirmed that he was with her while his wife thought he was at the library, from 7:40 until about 8:15. That was before he then drove himself to the library and called Peggy from the payphone. Lucy told the grand jury that their relationship included traveling together and, yes, vague hypothetical discussions about getting married one day. And that testimony, possibly even more so than being a person of interest in Peggy's attack, led Walker to resign his position from First United, and he eventually gave up his credentials entirely on September 2nd, 1987. A month later, Walker gave up all care decisions regarding Peggy and agreed for her parents to act as her guardians. And though Walker did see his kids regularly at that point, they stayed living with the family friends who had cared for them since the night of the attack. And then in November of 1987, Walker Railey left his wife, his children, and Texas altogether. He managed to stay off the radar for a bit, but he was soon found by journalists living in California with Lucy Papillon. He was working odd jobs to make ends meet, but this move did even more damage to his public reputation than even the grand jury had. Even those who believed Walker was innocent initially just saw him abandon his wife and children for the girlfriend. If he had a motive to kill Peggy to be free to move on with Lucy, well, it looked like he got his way. 1988, with no charges having been laid yet, Peggy's parents sued Walker civilly, stating that he, quote, intentionally, knowingly, maliciously, and brutally tried to kill Peggy, end quote. They wanted to get damages to help go towards her medical care. Walker did not respond to the lawsuit, and he did not show up to court to defend himself. A judge held a trial for about a day, and Walker was found civilly responsible for the attack on Peggy. Peggy was awarded $18 million, of which Walker would pay $0. The case really seemed like it would never go anywhere beyond the civil court until 1992, when the FBI decided to use some new DNA technology to test the envelopes the threatening letters had been sent in. And they found 44-year-old Walker Railey's DNA on them. The district attorney's office decided this was the last piece they needed to prove their circumstantial case. Walker Railey was arrested in California at the church where he was working as an administrator and charged with attempted murder. Walker's trial began in March of 1993, 6 years after Peggy's attack. And the trial coverage was pretty intense. And while it was being broadcast on court TV, their Dallas area ratings skyrocketed. As always, we're going to have our pretrial motions, and in this case, the judge ruled that the information about the civil judgment against Walker was not admissible, but the fact that Walker left his children, or abandoned them in the prosecution's words, with family friends was allowed in, as was Walker's suicide attempt. The state's case, like I said, was purely circumstantial. They did not do an opening statement to lay it out for the jury, but I'm going to do one for you because it's pretty helpful to have a blueprint. The state presented a few possible motives. One theory was that when Peggy talked to Walker during the 8:30 phone call, she asked him to come home so she could talk to him about something. Either she found out Walker had sent the letters, or she found out that he was having an affair, and she confronted him about it when he got home. He then attacked her and, thinking she was dead, left to go establish the rest of his alibi. Another theory was that Walker was trying to find a way out of his marriage to be with Lucy, but he didn't feel he could divorce Peggy without also destroying his chances at becoming a bishop one day. But if he was a widower, he would be able to move on with Lucy and keep his career. So he sent the letters to set up the idea that his family was being threatened and targeted before he then attempted to kill his wife. So it would follow that a big part of the state's case was to show that Walker manipulated the timeline, largely by using those car phone calls, but also witnesses. So let's lay it out. The first point is 6:38 p.m. when Walker called for the time from his car phone. He was back at his car at 7:26 when he called a babysitter he had coming for the weekend. At 7:32, he called Lucy at her home. And according to Lucy Papillon's testimony, we know Walker drove over to her house and stayed for less than 45 minutes, leaving around 8:15. At some point after 8, a librarian at Bridwell, the library Walker claimed to be at, did see him, and he asked her what time the library closed. At 8:30, he called Peggy from the payphone, and this is when she told him that she was putting the kids to bed, according to Walker. According to the state, this was a call where she likely asked him to come home so she could confront him about something. Shortly after this, Walker left the library and went to the Texaco station. He bought the wine cooler and also got gas with his credit card slip noting it was 8:53 p.m. And this is where we hit a dead zone of no one being sure they saw Walker anywhere, let alone at the library. There were some sightings of him there between 10 and 11, but from 9 until 11, specifically from 9 to 10, he had a huge gap in his alibi, one that the police say he tried to fill in later. According to Lucy's testimony, Walker called her again at 11 p.m. and asked if he could come over. She told him it was too late and she was tired, and this call, as far as I can tell from the reporting, did not show up on the car phone, and it's not clear where it was made from. The next point is around midnight. Walker was at a different library on campus, and he went up to the library staff member who was working at the resource desk. He handed him a card that had a book title written down, and Walker said it was for a book he couldn't find, and he wanted the resource librarian to look for it for him when she got in the next day. The card had the date and the time written on it. The date was right, but Walker wrote 10:30 p.m., even though it was nearly midnight. Walker then left the library, and at 12:03, he called home on his car phone. This was the call where Walker left a message and said it was 10:30 and told Peggy to lock the garage door. The state told the jury that this call was to first set up an alibi for 10:30 p.m., and second, to explain why Peggy went out to the garage where she was then attacked. If Walker wanted to actually talk to his wife, he would have called the private number, and he wouldn't have given a fake time. Walker then called again around 12:30 to say he was coming home, and he arrived home at 12:40, calling 911 at 12:43. The issue here that the state had was that they couldn't prove where Walker was at the time Peggy was attacked. And that was a problem for the defense as well. The state couldn't put him at the house, and the defense couldn't put him anywhere else. The first witness for the state was Peggy's mother, Billie Jo. She testified that a few days after the attack on Peggy, Walker asked her if she had seen a cord in the garage, and he seemed a bit agitated looking for it. Billie Jo was just under the impression it was something he needed to find, but the implication here at trial was that this was possibly the ligature that had been used to strangle Peggy, and Walker had lost control of where it was. On cross-examination, Bobby Jo was asked about her daughter's marriage to Walker, and she admitted that she had no idea of any violence and never saw or suspected abuse. Another key witness here was the DNA expert. They didn't have physical evidence directly tying Walker to the attempted murder, but they did have DNA from the envelope, from the threatening letters that did match Walker. It was interesting to hear a forensic expert try to explain DNA to a jury in the early 90s versus today, where you can assume that the jury at least knows what DNA is, or they at least know it exists. The forensic expert in this case had to start with the very basics. And so the cross-examination of the forensic expert was all about the accuracy of DNA and how strong the match was. This is all pretty typical. We still see it today, but I imagine when it was in front of a jury without a lot of knowledge of DNA, it probably made the entire thing just confusing. Another witness was Dr. Lucy Papillon, and though the state called her as a witness, I think her testimony probably helped Walker more than anything. She downplayed any talk they had of marriage and insisted that Walker respected and cared for his wife. She also testified she never saw Walker be violent, and she didn't believe he was capable of it. The defense case at trial was a straight innocence claim. He didn't do it. And to explain that, Walker Railey took the stand in his own defense and admitted he lied about where he went the night his wife was attacked. It wasn't because he was the attacker, but it was because he was trying to hide his affair with Lucy from his wife. That's the same reason he called her at midnight to leave a message saying he called at 10:30 and that he was at the library. Yeah, he was establishing an alibi, but it was an alibi to cover up the affair. Now, I'm not sure this entirely makes sense to me, though, because according to Lucy, they were not together at that time. Maybe he was just trying to account for being 45 minutes behind schedule because he had gone to her house before the library. After seeing Lucy, except for heading out to the Texaco station, Walker said he really was in the library all night. Walker was also asked about the card he handed to the library staff with the wrong time on it, and he said it's because he initially wrote the note at 10:30. He left it on the resource librarian's desk, but then when he was leaving around midnight, he saw the note was still on her desk and thought that it might get misplaced with the cleaning crew coming through, so he picked it up and handed it to a staff member instead. I suppose it's just a coincidence that he put the same time down as the fake alibi time he gave his wife. Walker did two things to try to make people think he was at the library at 10:30, and he did both of them around midnight. Walker was also asked about the night he found Peggy in the garage, and he became emotional in this testimony. Not an over-the-top production, but what looked like a genuine expression of sadness. I will say that Walker seemed very reasonable on the stand, showing the right emotion at the right times, and I actually had to remind myself that he made an entire career out of being charismatic and seemingly honest and virtuous while he was also having an affair behind his wife's back. So we know he can lie while sounding good. That's not to say just because he could lie means he did lie, but I do have to remember we can't take people at face value, and that I would be a terrible detective because I far too often believe people even when I shouldn't. Anyway, as for Walker's suicide note, which the state said was a thinly veiled confession, Walker read portions of it out loud. He said that the demon he was talking about was essentially the public perception of him versus his inner struggles. He privately struggled with faith, with his marriage, and with seeing himself as a good person, while he was publicly telling other people how to live a virtuous life. He believed he was being seen as strong and good, when internally he didn't believe he was either of those things. And this wasn't something that suddenly came up at trial. Walker had told another minister at the church multiple times prior to the attack on Peggy that he didn't believe the congregation would forgive him even one bad sermon. Others also said that Walker expressed feeling like he was under a lot of pressure. So this was an ongoing struggle that he told people about. Any guilt you could read into the suicide note was, according to Walker, his guilt over not being there the night that someone else tried to kill Peggy. Instead of being with his wife after all of those threats had come in, he was instead worried about a book deal and seeing his girlfriend. Like I said, Walker's testimony came across as pretty sincere, and in their closing statement, the defense said that the police had tunnel vision when it came to Walker Railey. There were other suspects who were not pursued, and that left holes in the state's case, and those holes were big enough for reasonable doubt. After both sides gave their closing statements, the jury took the case and came back in mid-April 1993 with the verdict. They found Walker Railey not guilty of attempted murder. When Walker was interviewed immediately afterwards, he said he was relieved, but that his thoughts were with Peggy's family because he knew that this had been very hard on them as they believed he was guilty and he just got away with it. 2 jurors gave interviews to Court TV, which gave us a little peek into the jury room. One of them sounded pretty confident in the jury's decision, not that Walker didn't do it, but that it hadn't been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The other juror said that he did believe that Walker attacked Peggy, and he was the lone holdout still voting guilty until the end. But when 11 other people heard the same exact case he did, and they were confident there was not enough evidence, he figured there was just something he wasn't seeing and went with the majority. After the verdict, Walker left Texas again. He gave up permanent custody of his children, and I assure you they were well loved, which I am sure was a big weight off of the shoulders of Peggy's family, who knew that those kids were Peggy's biggest concern. In February of 1997, in a settlement with Peggy's family, her parents, who were her guardians, consented to granting Walker a divorce and forgiving the $18 million judgment against him in exchange for Walker agreeing to monthly alimony payments. Within days of the divorce being granted, Walker remarried, not Lucy, another woman he was dating, but apparently there were some financial issues due to the legal proceedings and his difficulty finding work. I mean, even if you're acquitted from a serious charge, the aftermath can pretty much ruin your life. That said, the Dallas Morning News reported that in spite of Walker's claims of financial hardship when it came to making the alimony payments, he was living in a luxury apartment in LA. Texas Monthly quoted the rent as $3,000 a month, which is back in 1998, and said he also kept his apartment from before his new marriage. So exactly how financially devastated he was while still affording 2 apartments in LA is up for debate. Walker had gone out and done a bit of a lecture series after his acquittal, preaching to other ministers about the impact of religious scandal and what that does to people's faith. He used himself as the prime example, which is fair. He was a good example of this, both with his affair and with the attack on his wife. Now, I know he was acquitted for that and he is not guilty, but it is still a scandal because he went to trial for it. So I thought his messaging here would probably be pretty useful, but according to a 1993 LA Times article, which of course will be linked in my sources, his advice included cautions over things that could just be misconstrued or misinterpreted. Things like offering to drive children home alone. And then he also told them to use caution when, and I quote, counseling the wicked woman of the parish, end quote. And I have to say, I very much do not care for terms like the wicked woman of the parish, because your temptation is not someone else's fault, but whatever. Moving on, Peggy Railey stayed in the persistent vegetative state in a nursing home until her death in late 2011, 24 and a half years after being left for dead in her garage. She was 63 years old. A lot of people wondered if, with Peggy being deceased and her life expectancy having been cut short by the attack on her, was it possible murder charges could be brought? And the answer is no, not against Walker Railey at least. He had already been tried and acquitted for the crime. Now, the charge may be different after she died, but it was the same event, the same action, the same crime. So double jeopardy was attached. And unfortunately, as often happens in cases with an acquittal, the investigation all but stops. The state believes they had the right guy, and either the jury got it wrong or they just couldn't build a strong enough case against him. So unless new evidence appears to show that this was done by someone other than Walker, this case will remain officially unsolved. And I doubt new evidence will appear unless an investigator goes looking for it. But if you do happen to know something about the 1987 attack on Peggy Railey, you can call the Dallas police at 1-877-373-TIPS. Though they are not actively investigating, the number will be in the show notes in the event you do have the part of the puzzle that people need to get answers, and they can have the sliver of peace that comes with those answers.